And I brought the Willow yarn catalog and to show you, because I did say that it was formerly Soho Gradient yarn and now it's been renamed and it's under the Willow brand. So it's called Willow Rise. Here are all the different colorways they have. I personally think they are all lovely. Meadow is the one that I am working with, and this is Meadow 0110. So here are all the different colors, and it sells for $5.99 a ball. And again, you get 5 ounces, quite a bit of yardage, 475. So willowyarns.com, or you can go onto Hirschner's and you'll find it there too. Okay, this is going to be so much fun now because we begin our decreases. I wound up going 6 rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have not joined yet, as you can see, but because this particular yarn I'm working with seems to be in between a real light 3 and an average 4 weight, and on the blue hat that I showed at the beginning, I went up 5 rows. This is a little bit lighter, thinner. I didn't want it too short, too tight. And I have been working in the eye hook again just to refresh. And really, now that I've gone this far, I probably could have gone up that 2 steps up 2 hook sizes and gone to a J if I did want this portion a little bit more open, that blousing kind of look, to give just more drape, a little bit more of a slouch if I'd wanted to, but I think that this yarn will stretch some. I'm not going to take it out, but I think what I could do is perhaps lay a cloth, cover the band part, which is fine the way it is, and maybe just lightly run a steam iron. Not too close because this does have some acrylic in it, but just let it steam and then just use my hand and gently open up some of the stitches a little bit, and that will give some width. It's not tight, but it's fine. It's fine. I just I'm thinking for a little bit something different, and yet another option on if you've worked your stitch and maybe you would like it a little bit looser. That's one way that you could go about it, by relaxing the fibers without having to take it apart. But just remember, again, if your band is good, you want to cover that portion up. That's just my thoughts. It's not an expert technique or anything. It's just something that I happen to think of. Okay, so we've gotten this far. What I suggest at this point, however high you go up, before you start your decrease, get a locking stitch marker, place it somewhere in the top of one of your stitches of your last row, so you know where you landed before you start decreasing. Now, this stitch pattern, as I mentioned, I mean, it's very easy to see. You just count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can count up this way. Just be sure to include the double crochets as you go up, and it's very easy to see where your stitches are, where your rows begin and where they end. Some patterns are not so easily defined, but this just helps me, gives me a bit of a placement. So if I do go up and I realize, oh, it's going to be too tall, too slouchy, maybe I want to pull back a row, or it's too tight, not enough, I want to pull back some of those decrease rows and add another, then you know exactly where you are. You don't have to fiddle, count, any of that kind of thing. Okay, so let's just go ahead. I finished my last, which I ended with the cluster, and as I mentioned early on, it does not matter, like depending on how many rows you did, you will either finish with a cluster or finish with a double crochet, and I'm going to show you both. Now here I slip stitch normally into that stitch, and I'm just going to try it and see if it keeps the stitch looking like the other ones where I slip stitched into instead of going into it backwards. If not, I'll take it out and redo it, not a big deal. So because I began with the double the previous round, I'm going to begin with a cluster here. Yours will be the opposite. If you began with a cluster and then you're beginning with a double, and I'll show you that in a second, but the principle is the same. Okay, so we're going to begin by decreasing in every 6th stitch around, and it's not going to matter which stitch you begin with. This every 6th stitch. Remember early on how I showed you that this one cluster where you combine all 3 double crochets counts as a stitch, 1 stitch. Your chain 1 is 1 stitch. Your second cluster is 1 stitch. The chain in between is 1 stitch. Your double crochet is 1 stitch. The chain after is 1 stitch. That is for a reason, because we're going to need to count them. So I'm going to pull this out and show you, but it really is the same difference, and it's not going to matter. It'll be super easy to follow after this row. Okay, so I'm going to do my cluster. The first portion of the cluster, there we go, is 1 stitch. Chain 1, 2 stitches. Second half of the cluster, 3 stitches. Chain 1, 4 stitches. Double crochet in the center of the cluster, the next stitch, that is 5 stitches. The 6th stitch would be my chain 1, which we're going to skip, and that's what we're going to do all the way around if you are beginning like I am with this row with your double cluster. So again, the next stitch, what we're going to do is work into the double crochet. We'll do our cluster. Again, the first stitch, second, third, fourth, fifth, and the 6th stitch will be the chain 1. And we're working double cluster here, divided by the chain 1. You chain 1 again after the second portion of your cluster, right? Okay. Then you double into this space. It's just like we have been doing. But instead of doing the chain 1 after the double, you're going to skip it. That's what you do all the way around. I'm going to repeat that after I show you. If you're beginning your, so say pretend like, okay, say pretend I ended here. This row doesn't exist, so then I would be starting with a double crochet instead. So I'll plop that in, double crochet, 1 stitch, chain 1, 2nd stitch. The cluster, right, would be in the next stitch, if that's where you ended. Okay, so did I lose track here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Your next stitch would be the chain after the cluster. That's the one you're going to skip. So every 6th stitch. So you are either skipping a chain after your cluster or after your double crochet all the way around. All right, so I am going to go back put my cluster back in. One stitch, 2 stitches, three, 4, 5, skip the chain, which is the 6th stitch, and then repeat. Work my first portion of the cluster into my double. There's 1. Chain 1 is 2nd stitch, 2nd cluster, my 3rd stitch, chain 1 is the 4th stitch. The next up is the double crochet into my cluster is the 5th stitch. Next would be the chain 1 after. That's what we're going to skip. That's our first decrease. This is what we're going to do all the way around. And again, if how your rows end up, depending on how many you went up, you're either skipping a stitch after your double crochet or after your cluster all the way around. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so I see you back around. I'll show you what we're going to do on our next row of decreases. And I'm back. All right, hope that worked out well for you. Here I am, my last stitch, double crochet, and I do not chain after. That would be my 6th stitch, which I am skipping. So you're going to either a slip stitch like we normally have been doing. You're either gonna, like slip stitch into your double crochet or whatever stitch you used in place of that. And in my case, I'm going to just slip stitch into my get around in the double cluster. So I start by, like I did before, just going to the top of that chain. Okay, so now back in business. Put my replacement double crochet in there. Oh yeah, much better. Okay, chain 1. Oh, so now we are going to, oh no, wait a minute, gotta think. I'm starting with a double crochet. I'm going to skip the next chain afterwards, just like I did on the row below, because that was our decrease. And if we chain 1 here, we're just adding it back in. Now if you are starting with your double cluster, then you will skip the chain after your last cluster. You're going to keep the one in between for now. You would skip the chain after your last cluster because that's what you did on this row. And the same principle if you chain afterwards and you're just putting it back in. So it's kind of a wash. All right, so now what we're going to do is, there's 1 stitch. Now you're going to begin, in my case, with a cluster, 2 stitches, 3 is the chain, 4, and we're going to be skipping the 5th stitch. So the first 2 rows are in keeping with how they traditionally are with decreases. And if you're starting here with the double, the tighter it gets, the more it's going to pull over, and you might wind up losing the tops if you're doing the same type of stitch. So just to see where you are, and you're back, you've completed your round and you're back around to the beginning, because it's going to start to blend and kind of blur the lines a little more, if you will, as far as where your beginning and end is. That's a good time to put a stitch marker in. It's just easy. You see it, you know it, it's there. You don't have to think about it or worry about it. Okay, so again, on this row around, you are now skipping this round, row around. You are now skipping the chain 1 after each double crochet and after your double cluster. So after each double crochet, you're skipping the chain space, and at the end of your completed cluster, you're skipping the chain space. You are still putting the chain space in between the two, and that is every 4 stitch around, regardless of if you begin with the double or the cluster. I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to do that again. No chain, double crochets 1, chain, no, see the habit, there is the habit. You get, I don't know about you, get so much on a rhythm that I do that, so it really does take a little bit of thinking and paying attention doing this portion of it, because it's changing up from what we've already gotten in the habit to. But isn't this so pretty? Really, just to take a little quick second here to appreciate and admire the color changes. And I like how they're just a mix throughout, and it's very soft, very gradual. Okay, so no chain there, so that's 1 as the double, there's 2, 3, 4th stitch, and the 5th would be the chain after the cluster, which I'm going to skip. Just go right back into sequence again. No chain after the double. So that's the biggest thing, is just remember where you are skipping that chain. Go ahead, repeat this all the way around. Skip the chain after each double crochet and after each double cluster. See you back around. Okay, now before we carry on, I just want to bring up a couple of things. If you're going back around your row and you realized, oh nuts, I forgot to skip that chain, I put 1 in. It's up to you, but if it's just 1, I don't think you necessarily have to take the whole row out just for 1. When you come back around, I mean, if you had several, yes, but when you come back around, just work these 2 stitches together, and it'll bring you back to where you need to be. That's all. Okay, so another thing, I left this open just to show you. Now the more we decrease, it's going to start pulling these stitches apart a little bit, because we're tightening them with the hook that we are using. So keep an eye on your tension. Keep an eye on the separation between your stitches. If the actual stitch that you have worked and have joined to the stitch behind it, if that has too much of a space or a gap or an opening, it's pulling and it won't cinch with just applying a little bit of tension. You don't want to have to tug it down tight. That's not the point to this. But if that's happening, those are really all good indications, things to watch for, that it's time to move back down to the next hook size down. But it will, like when you work the stitch, okay, for example, I can feel that this is tightening up. I'm putting in a cluster here. When you work that stitch, you might need to cinch it down just a little bit more than you normally would if you're getting the full complete stitches that equal the original circumference of the hat. That makes sense. And just make sure that you're keeping that tension there. As you can see, I'm not pulling it tight, but I do have a secure hold on that. So I'm still chaining 1 in between the 2 clusters. And again, pulling that down, skipping the chain 1 after. Now I'm double crocheting, and the same thing here. I'm keeping my tension to where, keeping those stitches a little bit tighter and making sure it's really on there. Okay, it's really the stitches are together. They're nice. They're neat. They have even tension. It's really on there on my hook, as in on there, so it doesn't slip and put in slack where it shouldn't be. Thought maybe for a second there I did put in a chain. Okay, so that's it for this round. You can see now we're already starting to get that shape where it's curving in. So I have the base shape for the band where it curved out a little bit for the body to go around the largest portion, circumference of my head, and now we're forming and closing it in, forming that decrease. So here is where I put my little stitch marker. I'm just going to hold that with hold these 2 loops with my fingers. You can come in from the back, you can go in from the top. I don't know how much one really does hold after another. Now it does matter in the single and half double, so that's why I really recommend, it's a little bit tricky watching that tutorial for that, because you do different things. So I do believe that I am going to go down to the next hook size. So we are on our, let's count them, this is this stitch here, this belongs, I'm going to move that up just so I don't get confused. I'm going to move it up just a little higher on the same stitch, that's all, on the same row. See, now to me that's more clear. This was my last row of the regular amount of stitches before we decrease. So far I have decreased 2 rows, and now I'm on the 3rd, row 3 of the decrease. So I am going to go ahead and drop down a hook size, and you can just test it out and do a couple few and see if your stitches are holding together well, because you can, you know, down here there is some openness, so they don't have to be real close or tight. So I have slip stitched into my double crochet, or my alternate double crochet, chain 1. Now I'm going to begin my cluster. However, we're going to change this up again. So instead of doing a double cluster, we are only going to do 1/2 of that. We're going to do 1 cluster stitch followed by the chain 1, and then the next stitch we're going to do the double, next stitch 1 portion of the cluster and a chain 1. Hope that makes sense. And okay, here if you started with the cluster, or excuse me, here if you started with you ended with the cluster, you're going to do your double crochet as normal, no chain 1 after, and in the next stitch you will be doing just 1 cluster stitch, not the double, 1 cluster stitch and a chain 1. So it's the same thing, it's just a different placement, that's all. You start with one or you start with the other, all the rest is the same. Alright, so I am going to do one cluster, chain 1. It's the only time you're going to chain 1 on this round. The next stitch, which is in between the 2 clusters from the previous round, it's my double crochet, no chain. Next, and don't do this tight, especially if you drop down a hook. Just do your normal way your tension, but keep it even. That's always good. All right, so I did my one cluster. Now I'm going to chain one, double crochet my next stitch, which is in between the cluster. No chain. Only time we're chaining one is after the half, that one cluster. And you know what? There you go. You see how this is starting to kind of blend from the previous row into your new row. So I would do the stitch marker. Just put it here because it's a big stitch. I can see it, and I'm just putting it in the top of that first cluster there. Okay. Okay, so remember, no chain one. Just doing one cluster, not the double, not the full set, but we are chaining one after it. So that's it. One cluster, chain one, double crochet, one cluster, chain one, double crochet, or cluster, chain one, double crochet, cluster, chain one, double crochet. Okay, see ya on the next round. Almost there. Alrighty, I'm back around. Now, once you do this round, if you find that it's too bunched up, then maybe take it out if you want, and just go back up to this your larger hook size for one more row. Or if you're using 3 hook sizes, that mid one I believe would work really, really well. So it's getting smaller and smaller. It's going to really start closing up now, but I'm pleased with this. I think the gaps look pretty good. They're not too open, not too close, so I'm going to continue on. Take a little measurement where I am so far. I think that's going to be pretty good. You know, you can try it on. Try it on, see how it fits you. Even if it's for someone else, you probably know what your head is like, and as far as average, smaller, larger, and that'll give you an idea where to go with the sizing on yours. Okay, so I'm going to take my stitch marker out, and now in this next round, which is round 4 of our decrease, now we are going to slip stitch where I just took my stitch marker out of. That elongated V, elongated stitch, that is a cluster that connects all 3 of your double crochets. So this time we're not going into that chain 1. We are going into the top of the double crochet, slip stitch, and through the loop on your hook, because we're going to now eliminate the chain 1 after the cluster. So go ahead, chain 1 to lock that in, because if you chained 1 over here, then you will wind up possibly getting an extra stitch back in. We don't want that. All right, so go ahead and chain 1, lock that in, do your double crochet however you're doing it. Okay, remember again, no chain 1, but I am going to put a stitch marker in here. I'm going to wait to the next stitch. Sometimes it's a little easier once you have one anchored down. So as you go around and it's tightening up, your double crochet is going to move closer to your stitch to the left of it. So be careful make sure, because look, look, you know, can appear here now that it belongs with that cluster, and it does not. So now all we're going to do is double crochet in the cluster, the top of the cluster, and cluster into the double crochet, one cluster, no chain after, no chain in between anything. And it's just a habit to automatically want to do that. Now I'm going to put my stitch marker. That's why I like these. They're these little half circles. These little open circles. They're small, they slip around very easily. Very. Okay, so one double, one cluster. You do have to look for that was cluster went in the top of the double. Now here's the cluster already. We're going, and don't make it too tight. We're going to double in there. You might have to just open it up, not stretch it, but just open it up a little bit to see where you are. So here we go. Cluster in the double. And there are the clusters right after, double in the cluster. Cluster in the double, double in the cluster. Doesn't matter which one you start with as far as your own sequence. Now, because if you did one row less or more than mine, then, right, just like we did on up, what you start with, which stitch is going to be opposite of mine. But just know that your sequence is cluster in the double, double in the cluster. That's it. No chains in between. All right, I'll see you for what might possibly be the last round or one more after. We'll see. Okay, I am back around. It's really closing up. Now your yarn should lay smooth and not a whole lot of puckering. Not a lot of puckering. You might have a little pull here and there, but for the most part you should have a nice smooth transition. Have it be smooth, and that will tell you you are on the right track with the right hook. Take out the little stitch marker, and I would definitely put it back in after the next stitch, because I find when I go do a running stitch and cinch up my ends, it's just really nice being able to know where the beginning, where the end is. Do I need to go around again to reinforce that and tighten up any gaps? And then I know where I am, and I can count in my head, or if you have to write it down, how many of those running stitches or rows that you have done around, if you have a little stitch marker. So having 3, even if you need, another one laying around, they're great little tools to have on hand. Okay, so I'm slip stitching. I ended with my cluster, slip stitching to my first stitch. In my case was a double crochet. I'm just going to do it the regular way here. Now what we're going to do is cluster into the top of every double crochet around, cluster into the top of every double crochet around, which means we're going to skip the cluster on the row we just did. I chained 1, so because this is a double crochet, we're going to cluster into it. No chains, nothing. skip the cluster and cluster into the double crochet. Skip the next, no chain, skip the next cluster and the double crochet, which is getting even closer to the cluster, but it's still there. That's it. You just cluster into each double crochet around and put your stitch marker into the top of that double crochet so you know where you are, because it tends to blend. So say, for example, if you were starting, you already have a cluster here, don't work into it. You just skip every cluster and go into your double crochet. That's it. What you do all the way around, no matter which stitch you began or ended with, you're still doing the same. Okay, sorry for the bump there. All right, let's see how small or big our openings are. And you know, another thing too, looking at this is really depending on how thick your hair is, you could just tie it off and make this a messy bun hat if you want, or a ponytail hat if you wanted to. And if you needed your opening a little bigger, but dropping down one is too wide, you could do just some like double crochet together decreases around, not as many, or half double, because it's not going to be, that'd probably be better, because if you need a little more open, the opening, but not as wide as a whole stitch down, you could do half double crochets. You could do half double crochet, a type of a cluster, you know, just something that's going to blend in well with this. This is just going to be your last row, and then you could have one of those messy bun or ponytail hats. So hey, there's even yet another option that you can do. How versatile is this hat? Okay, see ya on maybe the last round. All right, and back to the beginning. Hole's pretty small here. Okay, so I completed my last cluster into the double crochet. Now we'll slip stitch to the top of my cluster. Pretty small now. And this is where you have to decide if you need another row or not. It's going to depend on how long you went. If you need a little more of a bigger decrease because of, you know, each stitch, rather than just sewing around the center together like we're going to do. That's up to you. Depends if you have a rounder head, a longer head, but you know, this is just an option way to further customize your hat. So you just have to decide how you're going to cinch it up, and you can try it, but keep the stitch marker in the top, and what you do is just repeat the last row. It's just, you can go ahead and it's not going to decrease anymore, but it's going to maintain the shape really well. We're going to cinch it in a little bit to close that gap. You can decide what you want to do. You would just do one cluster and each stitch around. You could do a little jog here and do a double crochet two together. So I did just kind of like starting a cluster right here. You see what I did? Yarned over, inserted my hook, pulled up a loop, pulled through the first two, then go into the next stitch insert, pull up 2, and pull up through all 3. That's a double crochet, 2 together. That's one way to bridge the gap. But here's another way to decide if you want that extra length or not, which I decided I did not, so I took it out back to where I was. But for example, you know, if I wanted this more snug, pulled down all the way beanie style to really cover my ears and come down a little lower on my forehead, then I would probably want that extra length, which I did in this hat to give me a little more full coverage, because this is for a little bit cooler weather. However, I want the option of being able to wear it as just a lighter weight beanie, because it is a lighter weight yarn. I made it transitioning going into spring in the warmer months, so I wanted the option of doing both. I have enough to give myself some ear coverage that I need, but if I get warm, the sun comes out, if I'm in a store, I can push it back off my face, off my head a little. It's not so much material I'm dealing with, because if I have too much slouching hanging down, it's just going to be too warm and kind of defeat my whole purpose. So I can wear it pulled down as a beanie, but I can also push it back and just have a very gentle slouch and have 2 looks in one. So I'm going to skip number 6, and for me this round is small enough to be able to give a nice close without it being real puckered. Okay, so what we're going to do is I just kind of eyeball, you know, I figure couple times around, so I have a length on my loop. Couple times around is going to be plenty to work the yarn through, because as you go you're going to cinch. That's probably too much. I just can't get over how much I have left over. I did a shawl and a hat. That's really nice. Okay, so where you joined here, put a stitch marker. There you go. I've learned on critical areas where I really want to see what's happening, I put a locking stitch marker, because inevitably they slip out when you're working in a really small area like that. So I went ahead, I remeasured. Now my hat, starting from the very bottom up to the tippy top, is right at about 8 inches or 21 centimeters high. Just where I decided to stop. You can, you know, do it however long that you want, as long as it fits your head comfortably. Okay, so really all we're going to do is just close up the center here, this center hole. So you can, if you have a technique that you prefer, however you like to do it, I am going to just pull my yarn all the way through rather than knotting it, so I don't have a big knot right there. Just looks like part of a stitch, because it will cinch up as I go around. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and cinch this up. There are different ways that you can do it if you want to. I'm leaving my stitch marker on, as mentioned before. That way I can see where I've come around. So I'm going to, instead of having go down from the front and having my loop cross over, I'm going to go underneath. And you can just do a running stitch, which is simply coming from the underneath side of one stitch at the top. I mean, I'm going to be working through the top of each cluster around, so up one side, down the other, up, down. You can do it that way, or you can simply whip stitch it if you like. That's another option. Make sure where I came down that side, I go up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, and then back up. I'm going to go through that little stitch maybe that I joined into. Let's see. First, I'm just going to go ahead and give this a real gentle pull. Go gently so you don't smush it together too much. I'm going to take my stitch marker off and just out of the loop and just the top loop and put it down one below. It still gives me a guide to where I began with it, but then now it's not in my way. As you can see, I just cut way too much, because as you pull it taut, you're going to get more length back of your yarn. But you know, I always say better to have a little more than cut yourself short. So I think I will just go ahead and go back into that little slip stitch there just to lock that in a bit. And you can whip stitch. That might give a nice little edging around also. So you can try that, see if you like it. If you don't, you can always take it out. So I went back up through that little slip stitch. And I'm going to go back down through the top of the first cluster. You know, maybe I'm going to go in between the stitches just to cinch up that hole a little bit. Now that I think about it, that's going to shore up these holes in between. And make sure you don't do what I just did. Okay, I think I thought maybe I hooked my caught my yarn with the yarn needle, but that was actually the stitch marker. Okay, so yeah, this can be a little fiddly. You can just work them in and out where you think is a good spot. I want to shore that, since I'm taking this out, since I know this is it, I'm done. Go ahead and take that stitch marker out, but leave the bottom one in, the base where you started. So I'm just going to go back through just to cinch those up even a little bit more. Placement doesn't have to be exact, as long as it looks neat and tidy. And where that big gap is right here, I'm going to go down and through the next stitch, just close that up a little bit more. Again, same with the next one. And I'm giving a gentle tug, little gentle tug as I go. Just eyeball that a little bit. I don't want to have too many stitches that overlap, go on top of the stitches that I made. There. I think that'll do it. And now I poked my yarn needle down into the center, so then I can weave in my ends on the inside of my work. Well, it's To me, that looks pretty neat, pretty clean, even, as you do have, like I said earlier, the holes between the stitches anyway. Oh, and I wanted it to be more open and airy, but not gappy at the same time. So just give it a nice little cinch down, but not to where it's bunched up either. And if, because I see here it's tending to want to separate a little bit, this might be a place where I want to cinch that up just a little more, maybe not, I don't know. So I'm going to go back through a loop behind it and just start weaving in my ends, and as I weave in my ends it will lock that in, secure it, tighten up a little bit anyway. So just continue to do that a few times in both directions. Weave in your ends until you're satisfied that your stitches are secure in a few different directions. I just go around and around and I make sure as I weave them that they are on the going through the stitches that are on the underneath side and not through the top. Otherwise you're going to have your stitches going back and forth in every which way. It's just not going to look so nice. Since there are more stitches down here, I'll probably just go this way a little bit, just to not so I don't create so much bulk at the top. And as you can even just run your yarn around if you see more gaps, and it will help to kind of shore those up a little bit as well. And you can check the outside of your work just to make sure, again, before you finish, tie it off, that it looks nice and neat. And that is all there is to it. And just one more time to lock that in. And I believe I am finished here, so cut my yarn. A little bit of a pull that might have been from that stitch marker. Okay. So now just going to connect the bottom, our two ends together where we started. I think Tasha's being naughty again. I could hear my husband calling for her. So just connect it. I go down. I start underneath the first stitch, and then I can bring my knot through to the back side. So this is, remember, this is a stitch, this is a stitch, so in my case I have one post and two back posts, so I don't want to pull that so tight, too tight, that I lose the stitch, but enough to where I can now bury and hide my knot. So, alright, to secure that in, I'm going to go around, back around the loop, rather than if I go through, go back around. So if I go through, it might loosen it through the way that I came, so I'm just going to go back, around, and then up to lock that in. Okay, here I am with just a little overview. Really everything is pretty much the same, and I'll tell you what I did about for the cuff last, but the numbers are all the same, doing a multiples of 6, the same spacing, the same chains, the same skip stitches. Everything we do is the same. The only difference here in the stitch pattern, to work back to Jay's cowl, is instead of alternating every row where you have a cluster, and then on the next row you would have a double crochet in the cluster and a cluster in the double crochet, we're just stacking 2 of the same on top of each other, and then we alternate. So you have 2 clusters, one on top of the other. You just put the double cluster in that chain 1 space in the double cluster and the double crochet and the double crochet, and then on the next 2 rows, that's when we alternate. Then we do 2 rows of the alternating double crochet, and then the next 2 are back into the double clusters. And I do think that the best yarn that will work for this is going to be a lighter yarn, like a lighter number 4, this Yarn Bee Chloe yarn, or the equivalent the Red Heart Unforgettable, as far as the weight, how it acts on the yarn. Really, it's to me, working it up is very similar, except with this it's going to be different because you have mostly the wool content on it. But anyway, a lighter weight or number 3 yarn. And the decreasing, and the reason for that is because then you can get at least 3 full alternates, repeats. Here's a repeat, here's a repeat, here's a repeat. So you can get 3 full, and you'll be able to see a nice picture of the pattern before we start to decrease. And this is just where I stopped. I'm kind of on the fence of going up 1 more or not. But anyway, as far as the decrease goes, everything else is the same. It's whichever row you end with, whether your starting point or your ending point is the double cluster or the double crochet, and as explained in my video, all the rest is the same. So this is really easy, straightforward. And as far as the band portion, I decided I wanted a cuff for this because this is a little bit warmer yarn. It would have been perfect for a week ago, and who knows, the weather this time of year can be pretty indecisive and flip-flop back and forth anyway, at least where we live. So for the cuff, what I did was a double crochet ribbing, working in the back loop, chained however many number of chains with the length that I wanted, and then when I turned, I work in the back loop of every stitch except the very first one and the very last one. I go through both loops to give some security and just to keep those, it secures the ends and it keeps the stitches a full stitch together. And so just when you do your length, be sure that you're going to have enough for when you turn it, so the finished portion of it to be the width that you want it to be. Now there really is a front and a back, an inside and an outside to this stitch, but it's so similar because you're working back and forth, it's a little harder to tell. My opinion, there's one side that's just a little bit more finished and nicer than the other, and sometimes you can tell by your edging, but if you can't tell, you can mark it at the beginning. But if you forget or you can't tell on this, I think both sides look nice, so it's really not all that critical. Here you can see my seam, but that will be covered. Oh, and on the end that shows up or the end that's going to be my edging, I use that same chainless double crochet that I did in my work that I did in this hat that I showed you. So that's what I did on each last stitch on the edge, and you know, to me that just, I mean, look at that. I think that gives a really, really nice edging. And then if you do decide after the fact, maybe you cut this a little too short, or you decide, you know, I'd like to put just a little extra something on there, maybe just a very delicate small scallop to work back to the body of the hat. And it's a nice kind of, I don't want to say a cheat way, but good way to add a little bit extra depth if you cut yourself short. By doing this type of stitch, it really gives you a full stitch to work around or into. And something else real quick to show you, this edging here. Oh, okay, so gotta rewind there a sec. All right, so this is the outside, this is my inside, and this is where I'm going to do my single crochet all the way around to. That's the inside of my work, so that when I do fold this, it will do two things. It's going to cover that up a little bit, and then the nicer part of your outside of the work is going to be on the outside. So you connect, you connect, and you put, because I did a double crochet, 2 single crochets will need to go into each double crochet section, 2 2 2 all the way around, because 1 double crochet equals that of 2 single crochets. But just be sure when you come around to your seam that you don't count that seam as a stitch, because you're going to wind up with extra stitches. So before you begin the body of your work, count these and make sure that, count these as in the single crochets, and make sure you have your multiples of 6 so that your pattern will work out the same and you won't have to undo all of that. But I wanted to show this to you particularly because let's see, I went down to a G hook for the ribbing, and then I went up to an I hook, I believe. I hope I better remember this, because yeah, I did. I went up to an, because I have to finish it. Yes, so I went up to an I hook, and I've worked with this yarn before and I know how stretchy it is. So G hook for the ribbing, I hook for the body, and I think I stuck with a G hook for doing the single crochets, and you can see how bunched up they are, and it deforms the shape a little bit, because then now I'm trying to cram and I hook in there just like I was saying here, and that is why when I went to this hat I went up 1 hook size. So because this yarn's kind of catchy on itself and I already had to redo it a couple times, I thought that that's enough doing and redoing of the same yarn, otherwise it's going to wind up not looking very nice. So I decided, well, I'm going to flip this, I'm going to put a button on it, it'll be fine, I'm going to wear it. It's not like I'm something that I would gift or sell. So anyway, yeah, I just wanted to show you that, so that good tip for you, I hope. All right, well, that's it. And good. Well, I really hope that if you make this, you enjoy it, and you'll find that once you do it one time, it works up so quickly. It really, really does, and it's an easy pattern. So thank you.